"You're coming with me," he said. The words were not a question, not an offer, but a statement of fact, as solid and unyielding as the granite bluffs that cut across the horizon. The dust of the dry road clung to everything, a fine red powder coating the cracked leather of his boots, the flanks of his steady horse, and the pale, exposed skin of the woman who stood shivering in the brutal afternoon sun. 3 men, her late husband's kin, stood near their wagon, their faces a mixture of smug satisfaction and scorn. They had done their work, a final, public act of dispossession, stripping her not only of her home and her name, but of her dignity itself, leaving her with nothing on the border of a stranger's land. The oldest of them, a man with a hard, pinched face and eyes like chips of flint, spat into the dirt. "She's grace and property, owed to us. You've no business here." Abel's gaze did not waver from the woman. He saw the tremor in her shoulders, the way she stared at a point in the far distance, refusing to meet the eyes of her tormentors or her rescuer. He swung down from his horse in a single fluid motion, his movements economical and deliberate. He untied the thick wool blanket from behind his saddle and walked toward her, the space between them charged with a silence that drowned out the wind. He didn't speak again as he wrapped the heavy fabric around her, his hands careful not to touch her skin, the gesture one of profound, impersonal respect. He then turned to face the men, his expression unchanged, as placid and formidable as a winter lake. "Get off my land." The journey back was a silent procession against a vast, indifferent sky. The woman, Lena, sat huddled in front of him on the saddle, the coarse wool of the blanket a rough comfort against her skin. She could feel the solid wall of his chest at her back, a steady, unthreatening presence that asked for nothing. She focused on the rhythm of the horse's gait, the creak of the leather, the soft thud of hooves on the parched earth. Each step took her further from the life that had been dismantled piece by piece and then shattered in a final, cruel gesture. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Abel rode with a stillness that seemed to be a part of the landscape itself, his eyes scanning the rolling hills and shadowed canyons with an ingrained vigilance. He did not speak, did not offer platitudes or ask questions that she had no answers for. His silence was a refuge, a space where she could begin to gather the scattered fragments of herself without the pressure of explanation or performance. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western clouds in brutal strokes of orange and crimson, the colors of a fresh wound. The light caught the sharp lines of his face, revealing a map of sun and hardship etched around his eyes. He was a man made of the same unforgiving material as the land he worked, yet there was a quiet integrity in his posture, a promise of safety that she hadn't felt in years. As the first stars pricked the deepening twilight, the faint glimmer of a single lantern appeared in the distance, a tiny spark of warmth in the immense, gathering dark. It was the first sign of a destination, a place she was being taken to, not a place she had chosen, and the fear, cold and sharp, briefly returned. His ranch was nestled in a small, protected valley, a collection of sturdy, unadorned buildings that looked as if they had grown from the earth itself. A modest house, a solid barn, and a web of fences stood against the encroaching wilderness, a testament to relentless effort and quiet endurance. He led the horse to a trough, slid from the saddle, and then reached up for her. His hands were calloused and sure as they circled her waist, lifting her down to the ground. For a moment her legs would not hold, and he steadied her without a word, his grip firm until she found her balance. Inside, the house was sparse and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. The furniture was handmade, worn smooth with use. There was a faint scent of wood smoke, coffee, and old leather. He pointed to a closed door. "That room is yours. There are clothes on the bed." "They were my mother's." He moved to the stove, his actions practical, his focus already on the next necessary task. He lit a fire, the crackle and flare of the kindling filling the quiet room with a sudden, welcome life. Lena went into the room and saw a simple cotton dress and a worn shift laid out on the quilt of a narrow bed. They were clean and smelled of lye soap and sunshine. She shed the heavy blanket, the last remnant of her humiliation, and dressed in the borrowed clothes. They hung loosely on her frame, but they were a shield, a beginning. When she emerged, he had 2 plates of beans and bacon on the simple wooden table. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin plates and the soft sigh of the fire. She watched him, this quiet, severe man who had intervened with the force of a natural law. He ate with the same focused intention he applied to everything, his gaze directed at his plate. He asked nothing of her, not even her name. It was a mercy she hadn't known she needed. The first days passed in a slow, silent rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Abel rose before dawn, the soft thud of his boots on the floorboards the only alarm clock. He would be gone for hours, tending to his few cattle, mending fences, existing in a state of constant, purposeful motion. He left food for her on the table, a piece of bread, a bowl of stew, without ceremony. He did not intrude on her solitude, did not knock on her door. He gave her space as if it were a physical commodity, a balm for a wound he could not see but knew was there. Lena remained within the walls of the house, a pale ghost haunting the edges of his life. She explored the small space, her bare feet silent on the cool plank floors. The house was a reflection of the man, everything had a purpose, nothing was superfluous. In the room she had claimed, she found a small wooden box containing a few cherished items, a set of whittled birds, a faded photograph of a stern-looking woman with Abel's eyes, and a single, chipped porcelain teacup, its delicate handle broken off. She held the fragile cup in her hands, its uselessness a strange comfort. It was broken, like her, but it was still beautiful. One afternoon, driven by a need for air that felt thick and close, she stepped onto the porch. The sun was bright, the air sharp and clean. In the distance, she could see Abel, a solitary figure repairing a section of fence line, the rhythmic strike of his hammer a steady heartbeat against the vast silence. He did not turn or wave, but she saw his movements slow for a fraction of a second, a minute hesitation that told her he knew she was there, watching. It was the first time she had willingly stepped out to meet the world, and he had granted her the dignity of not making it a spectacle. A week after her arrival, she saw it. A dark speck on the distant eastern ridge, a place where no rider should be. It was too far to make out details, but she knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in her bones, who it was. The Graysons. They were watching. The figure remained for nearly an hour, a silent, malevolent sentinel, before finally disappearing back over the rise. A shiver, unrelated to the day's warmth, traced a path down her spine. The valley no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a cage. She retreated back into the house, the walls suddenly feeling thin and fragile. That evening, Abel came in from his chores and did not immediately start dinner. Instead, he laid a worn piece of oilcloth on the table and carefully began to disassemble his rifle. He worked under the quiet hiss of the lantern, his large hands moving with unpracticed, unnerving grace. He cleaned each piece methodically, the metallic scrape and click of the components echoing in the small room. He did not speak of the rider on the ridge, did not acknowledge the threat that now hung in the air between them, but his actions were a conversation in themselves. Lena sat in a chair by the hearth, watching him, her hands clenched in her lap. The methodical cleaning of the weapon was not an act of aggression, but one of sober preparation. It was an acknowledgement of the world outside their quiet valley, a world that had not forgotten her. She understood then that his protection was not a momentary act of charity, it was a responsibility he had shouldered, and he would not set it down lightly. The air grew thick with unspoken understanding, a shared knowledge of the danger that lay waiting just beyond the horizon. One night, the sharp, distressed bleating of a ewe woke the homestead. A storm was moving in from the north, the wind moaning around the corners of the house. Abel was already pulling on his boots, grabbing a lantern as he headed for the door. Driven by an instinct she didn't understand, Lena followed him out into the churning darkness. In the small birthing pen near the barn, a ewe was struggling, a lamb breech and barely breathing. The wind whipped at them, threatening to extinguish the lantern's fragile flame. Abel worked with a calm, focused urgency, his hands gentle but firm as he tried to reposition the lamb. "Hold this," he commanded, his voice tight, gesturing with his head toward the lantern. Keep the light steady. Lena took it, her hand surprisingly firm as she held the warm glass, angling the beam so he could see. She knelt in the dirt and straw, the wind tearing at her hair, and held the light unwavering. Time seemed to suspend, marked only by the heaving breaths of the ewe and Abel's low, murmuring reassurances. Finally, with a great effort, the lamb was born, slick and still. For a heart-stopping moment, it didn't move. Abel cleared its airway and rubbed its small body vigorously with a piece of burlap. Then, a shudder. A weak cry. It was alive. A wave of relief, so profound it was almost painful, washed over Lena. They had saved it. Together. As Abel settled the lamb with its mother, he glanced at Lena, his face illuminated by the lantern she still held. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze lingered for a moment longer than usual. Later, back in the warmth of the house, as the first drops of rain began to pelt the roof, she spoke. "Thank you." The two words were small against the growing roar of the storm, but they were the first she had offered freely. He simply nodded, the gesture carrying the weight of a lengthy conversation. In the weeks that followed, a quiet transformation began. The silence between them shifted from one of necessity to one of comfort. Lena started to venture out more, first just to the porch, then to the small, neglected vegetable patch behind the house. She found a rusty trowel in the barn and began to methodically pull the weeds, her hands finding a sense of purpose in the rich, dark soil. The work was grounding, a way to reclaim a piece of the world for herself. She discovered a small spring of mint growing wild by the fence and began tending to it. One afternoon, Abel came back to find a glass of cool mint water waiting for him on the porch rail. He stopped, looked at the glass, then at her, where she sat on the steps. He picked it up and drank it all, his nod of thanks all the communication that was needed. She began to take on small tasks around the house, mending a tear in his work shirt with neat, precise stitches, sweeping the floors until they shone. These were not acts of servitude, but acts of partnership, of creating a shared existence. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she finally told him. Her voice was low and even, a recitation of facts rather than a plea for sympathy. She spoke of her husband, a kind but weak man, and his death from a fever. She spoke of how his family, the Graysons, saw her as nothing more than a failed investment, another mouth to feed, a woman who had produced no heir. They had taken the farm, the livestock, and when they had decided to finally cast her out, they took her clothes as a final, bitter lesson in ownership. Abel listened without interruption, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. The only sign of his reaction was a muscle that clenched and unclenched in his jaw, a small, hard knot of controlled fury. When she finished, a profound quiet settled over the room, but it was a quiet of shared knowledge, of a burden finally set down and witnessed. The sky had been a bruised purple all day, the air heavy and electric with a coming storm. The cattle were restless, lowing nervously in the pasture. Abel was reinforcing the barn door when he saw them, 3 riders cresting the familiar eastern ridge, no longer distant specks but clear and resolute figures moving with grim purpose. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his trousers, his face a mask of stone. He walked to the house, his stride unhurried. Lena was on the porch, her hands gripping the railing, her knuckles white. She had seen them too. "Go inside," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. She hesitated, her eyes wide with a familiar terror. "Go inside," he repeated, softer this time, but with an edge that brooked no argument. She retreated into the house, leaving the door slightly ajar. Abel did not get his rifle. He simply stood on the top step of the porch, waiting, a solitary, immovable object. The 3 Grayson men rode into the yard, their horses kicking up dust. The father, flanked by his 2 brutish sons, pulled his mount to a halt. "We've come for what's ours, Abel," the old man sneered, his voice thin and cruel. "The woman. Send her out." Abel's gaze was steady. "She's not yours." The younger son dismounted, a length of rope in his hand, a smug grin on his face. "She is. By law and by right. We mean to have her back. He took a step toward the porch. She stays, Abel said, and his voice, though low, carried over the rising wind with the finality of a closing door. The sun lunged forward. Abel's movement was a blur of speed and brutal efficiency. He stepped down to meet the man, not with a fist, but with his entire body, a block of solid force that sent the younger Grayson sprawling into the dirt. The father and the other brother reached for their belts, but froze as Abel looked up, his eyes now blazing with a cold fire they had never seen. "Leave," he said. "And don't come back." It was not a threat, it was a prophecy. Defeated not by violence but by a will far stronger than their own malice, they hesitated, then grabbed their fallen family member and retreated, their angry shouts swallowed by the first clap of thunder. As they galloped away, the heavens opened, and a deluge of cleansing rain began to fall. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. The world seemed brighter, the colors more vivid. The tension that had hung over the valley for weeks was gone, washed away with the rain. In its wake, a new, more gentle quiet settled between Abel and Lena. It was a peace born not of avoidance, but of a confrontation faced and won. Life fell into a new rhythm, one of collaboration. She worked alongside him now, her initial fragility replaced by a quiet, resilient strength. She learned to patch the roof, to check the fences, to identify the herbs that grew in the foothills. He, in turn, began to soften in small ways. He would leave a wildflower on the table for her in the mornings, or point out the hawk that circled high above the valley. Words were still sparse between them, but they were no longer as necessary. Their communication existed in shared tasks, in knowing glances, in the simple comfort of occupying the same space. One afternoon, Abel came into the house to find she had finally finished her project. The broken teacup sat on the kitchen windowsill, painstakingly pieced back together. The cracks were visible, a web of fine dark lines, but it was whole. And it was no longer empty. She had filled it with the tiny, vibrant purple flowers that grew wild by the creek. Abel stopped and looked at it for a long time. He reached out and gently touched one of the petals, his calloused finger a stark contrast to its delicate texture. He looked at Lena, who was watching him from across the room, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a small, slow smile that transformed his stern features, lighting them from within. In that moment, the house was no longer his house, but their home. A quiet promise of a future, pieced together and made beautiful, had finally taken root. The seasons turned, wrapping the small valley in the gold of autumn and the stark white of winter, before yielding again to the tender green of spring. Abel and Lena built a life, their story told not in grand declarations but in the steady accumulation of quiet moments. It was a life of shared labor and mutual respect, a silent testament to the idea that healing can be found in the solid ground beneath one's feet and in the steady presence of another. Their sanctuary, won through a moment of defiance and built with patient hands, remained untouched by the outside world. They were two solitary souls who had, against all odds, found a way to grow together, like two trees whose roots had intertwined deep beneath the soil, drawing strength from one another. Their pasts were not forgotten, but they no longer defined their present. The scars remained, like the delicate lines on the mended teacup, a reminder not of the breaking, but of the strength it took to become whole again. On a clear spring morning, as they stood together on the porch, watching the sun rise over the eastern ridge, the same ridge where a threat had once appeared, a sense of profound peace settled over them. They had built more than a ranch, they had built a world. I wonder what you were thinking, watching a story like that. Maybe you were focused on the injustice, on the cruelty people are capable of. Or maybe you were drawn to the quiet strength of a man like Abel, someone who doesn't need to shout to be heard, whose power is in his conviction. We see so much noise in our world, so much blustering and posturing, that it's easy to forget what real strength looks like. It isn't loud. It's the steadfastness of a mountain. It's the quiet integrity of a man who does the right thing simply because it is the right thing to do. And what about her? The woman who had everything taken from her, left with nothing but shame. Her journey back wasn't loud either, was it? It happened in small, quiet acts. Tending a garden. Mending a shirt. Holding a lantern steady in a storm. Have you ever noticed how the biggest changes in our lives often start with the smallest, most courageous steps? It reminds us that resilience isn't about being unbreakable. It's about the willingness to piece yourself back together, even if the cracks still show. This story is about the power of quiet kindness and the profound courage it takes to both offer and accept it. We tell stories like this because they connect with a deep and simple truth, that even in the harshest landscapes, a sanctuary can be built and a life can be reborn. If this story of quiet strength and redemption resonated with you, there's another one I think you'll want to see. It's about a man who lost his way and found his purpose by listening to the whispers of the wild. Click here on your screen to watch it now.